Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Ron Christopher. I am a board member here at the Beach Institute and the chair of the Cultural Affairs Committee. And I'd like to welcome each of you to the second installment of the Beach Institute Lecture and Learning Series. I'm happy to see we have very much a full house tonight, so thanks everybody for coming out. With these lectures, what we intend to do is each month present to the Savannah community a provocative, hopefully very much a thought-provoking lecture on various topics. And topics span from serious ones like this one today, to entertainment, to culture, to luminaries in the arts and sciences. We have a wide range of topics that you can expect to see over the next several months. Typically, in fact, every lecture is scheduled for the fourth Wednesday of every month. I've asked each of you to leave your contact information in the form of your email, so hopefully everyone going forward will be aware of upcoming lectures. Our speaker for tonight is Dr. Larry Stokes. Dr. Stokes is social science professor at Savannah State University. He earned his PhD in sociology at Howard University and master's and bachelor's degrees in criminal justice at the University of Tennessee. He has written extensively in the area of criminal justice in numerous scholarly journals. In 2005, he received a certificate of appreciation from the City of Savannah for his work on the Mayor's Public Safety Task Force, which aimed to reduce crime in our city. I'd be remiss not to take this opportunity to thank the City of Savannah, which is making these lectures possible. So without further ado, allow me to present to you Dr. Larry Stokes.
I would like to thank you for selecting my paper in order to, and hopefully to enlighten you regarding incarceration and college enrollment of African American males. That I became interested in the topic, but primarily because of, at the time, Senator Barack Obama had noted that there were more African American males in prison than there are in college, which was not true, okay? But I wanted to know whether or not, if that is true, if I only just focus on the state of Georgia. And so this research is primarily directed at 19 universities in the university system of Georgia that is prior to consolidation of several universities. And so this data primarily came from that of 2012 data from the Department of Correction, and it also came from the University System of Georgia by the numbers, where you could go in and you could get whatever data that you want. So there's no surveys involved, only the surveys are the surveys in which the university required universities to submit their data annually to the department, to the University System of Georgia. And so what I want to begin with in terms of so we're really talking about mass incarceration. And following the Emancipation Proclamation, Southerners, conservatives employed various discriminatory policies and laws to maintain and oppress and suppress people of color, especially African Americans. Political conservatives used black codes, Jim Crow laws, vagrancy, literacy, and poll tax. Another method utilized to suppress African Americans was that of mass incarceration, which began almost immediately following the Emancipation Proclamation. But the first go ahead. You can go ahead. Okay, but the first proportion of people who were in prison in terms of large numbers were that of Europeans. In fact, the data shows that since 1850, when first prison statistics reported were published, the combined percentage of foreign-born persons, blacks, and other minority groups incarcerated by the criminal justice system has ranged from 40 and 50% of inmates. But at the top, it says the first inmates were Europeans who made up large proportion of the prisoners, and African Americans had small representation. As the percentage of foreign-born, let's say Europeans decrease, African Americans and that of Hispanics increase. Since 1865, in fact, we had privatization of prisons back in 1865, where blacks were hired out. In fact, it says freemen were charged with not carrying out their sharecropping commitments. They were hired out. From 1870 until 1910, in the state of Georgia, 88% of hired out convicts were black. In Alabama, 93% were hired out as minors. And in Mississippi, they somewhat used that of plantation methods in which they had blacks working. So according to Lowry, he said there are more African American disenfranchised than there were when the 15th Amendment was adopted in 1870, which granted African Americans the right to vote. Go through. Anything in red, just continue. So I'm trying to skip through a lot of this so we could get to the data, okay? If the media could reverse the vicious cycle of sensationalism, police officers could eliminate biases towards minorities, political short-sightedness in developing policies, and the public impatience that encourage ineffective quick fixes for crime, this country may be able to reduce mass incarceration. To prevent crime, the political right argued for law and order reform. Law and order is a euphemism for the total repression and possibly annihilation of those in the society who cry for justice, where little justice can be found. Law and order policies are used by politicians to stroke white fears and appeal to voters. That crime, especially crimes committed by blacks, should be dealt with harshly. One such policy is that of the war on drugs, initiated by the Nixon administration. In the war on drugs, the offender is racially defined, that is, African American and Hispanic. And as such, police, law enforcement agencies, they use various investigative tactics in terms of infiltrating the black community in order to arrest them. In fact, it says, well, that's exactly what it says. Okay, good. Okay? Even though I'll say illicit drug use is approximately the same for African Americans as it is for Europeans, African Americans, however, are much more likely to be arrested, jailed, denied bail, convicted, and sentenced for drug possession and use. Similarly, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health found that African Americans and whites use drugs at similar rate, but the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of whites. African Americans represent 12.5% of illicit drug users, but 29% of those arrested for drug offenses and 33% of those incarcerated in state facilities for drug offenses, they are African Americans. The National Institute similarly found that whites use cocaine at seven times the rate of blacks, use crack cocaine at 8 times the rate of blacks, and use heroin at 7 times the rate of blacks. White conviction rate at the same time increased, but nowhere near that of blacks. No, didn't even come close to the percentage of African Americans who are incarcerated for drug use, whether it's cocaine or whether it's crack. In 7 states, for example, African Americans were found to constitute 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. In at least 15 states, African American males admitted to prison on drug charges at a rate 20 to 57 times greater than that of whites. Okay, approximately 6 in 10 inmates is either African American or Hispanic. If trends continue, nearly 1/3 of African American children born today will go to prison during their lifetime. Okay? When all punishment, probation, intermediate sanctions, or whether it's probation, whether it's first offender, whatever intermediary status in terms of probation or jail, it says that more than 1 in 3 African American men in their 20s are under correctional supervision, which I will show even in this study here in Georgia. In the city of Baltimore, Tony found that approximately 56% of young African Americans were under correctional supervision. In Washington, D.C., half of all African American men aged 18 to 35 were under some form of correctional control. Go back, I saw the Georgia. Let's stay at the Georgia. Let's go back. In Georgia, for example, the rate of incarceration per 100,000 state resident is 544 for whites, 2,153 for African Americans, and 620 for Hispanics. White males aged 18 to 64 also represent 1.8% of the male prison population. African American males, nearly 7% of the incarceration here in Georgia. On any given day, more than 2.2 million African Americans are in jail or in state, federal prisons, and nearly 5 million are on probation and parole supervision and living in communities. And going to that of black in education, okay? The number of African Americans with criminal records, according to the NAACP, is about the same as the number of African Americans with 4 years degree. About the same. Okay? Young black males score below their counterparts when it comes to graduation rates, literacy rate, and college preparedness. And many African American men, in turn, are virtually locked out of employment and are filling up the nation's prison disproportionately. Mass incarceration has created a unique form of stratification within the African American community for young men, and most at risk of imprisonment. Incarceration is viewed as a form of institutionalized membership. For young black men who have been to college, dropped significantly to 1 in 25 compared to 1 in 3 for high school. In Chicago, young African American men are more likely to go to prison than to college. In fact, there were more, this is in Illinois, not the entire country, there were more African American males who were released from drugs in 2010 than there were, I guess that's the next slide, I'm speaking ahead of myself. So in 1999, for example, only 992 African American males received a bachelor's degree from Illinois state universities, while roughly 7,000 black men were released from state penitentiary for that of drug use. The Sentencing Project similarly found that African American males were much more likely to be convicted and sentenced for drug offenses than whites in the state of Georgia. Okay, the Justice Policy Institute found that more African American males were under jurisdiction Okay, given those numbers, they also mentioned that the justice attributed this finding to increased state investment in corrections and decreased support for higher education throughout the 1980s and the 90s. For nearly a decade, people believed that there were more African Americans in prison than in college. This statement probably never was accurate. Nevertheless, it garnered attention in the press, and more than a decade later, still serves as a talking point for summarizing the social and economic challenges for that of African American males. Mass incarceration has affirmed the political strategies of the 1980s and the 1990s, developed by political conservatives. Bigger jails, more wars, data banks, wiretaps, and a genuinely regimented society include the sharp curtailment of black college students, according to that of Samuel Yett. For some of you who have written, he had written the book called The Choice. Okay. So this present study, as I mentioned already, the data come directly from the state, and I'm just analyzing the data that was given that's presented by the state. I'm not also in this, I'm not include, but primarily just focus on those that are in prison. Jails, local probation, and first offenders, they're not included at all. Just as in this study, I did not even look at the community colleges. So this is only geared towards 19 universities that existed prior to consolidation. Okay, and let's tell you where I got the data from. Findings. Okay, try my best at this here. Okay, the findings, this is showing the percentage of blacks in these 6 major research institutions. And so blacks total out of Georgia State University, Georgia Institute of Technology, University of Georgia, Georgia Southern, Valdosta State, and Kennesaw. They comprise 7% of the total population. That is out of 124,012 students. Okay? So in Table 1, in 2012, data indicate that 6 universities had a total enrollment of 124,000. African American males represented a total of 89,57, or 7%, enrolled full-time in these research institutions. Let's go to Table 2 next. It's the next slide. So this is just showing the percent of blacks that are incarcerated, as well the percent as well as the total number. So in that of 2012, there were 12,225 African American males in prison. Okay, out of 20,313, and whites represented 35% of that population. And over here, we have these are all blacks based by age, and I'm gonna go through that, show you in terms of, but if you look at the data here, the majority, and these, I'll just make this point, these are people who are the same college age, okay, who are locked up. So we're talking about 8,202 inmates of college age, okay? I don't know how, Mr. Chris, we taking questions now or later?
I have a real easy question. Like on one of the tables further back, it showed like University of Georgia had 3,100 black males.
Yeah, that's it.
University of Georgia had 635 black males out of 16,000.
Yeah.
I assume that includes athletes and.
No. Yeah, yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yeah. So my other question later on, you should have asked me this at home. Okay, that's my wife asking these questions. But anyway, but anyway, my statement later on was going to be, if you drop the athletes from this total number, the percentage of African Americans will even be even smaller. Okay, and then the percentages would oftentimes, they would be larger as well in terms of those in comparison. And so we'll talk about that, okay? So, but anyway, let's go to the next slide. Let's go to, so I just showed you, go back one. Okay, so I go back another one. So I wanted, because the next slide is dealing with these two tables here, okay? The next slide is dealing with table 2 and table 3, okay? So next slide, please. So in table 3 represent the age group of only African Americans incarcerated. This is also the same age group of traditional college age students. Of this group, 8,202 African American males were incarcerated, okay? And 8,957 were enrolled in 6 research universities, a sum of which is 17,159, which represent 52% in college and 48% were incarcerated. Okay? So even though the total numbers are nearly the same, the data, however, reflect a ratio of 9 to 10. That is, for every 10 African American males in college, 9 are in prison. That's in these six universities here. 9 are incarcerated. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, these are 13 universities here. These 13 universities, they're state and regional universities. They're state and regional universities. And here, can you just slide down and see the total? Just a little. Okay. It won't. Let me see what it is. Okay. Hold on. The total. That's what I'm looking at, the total. So the total for those 13 state, the total enrollment for those 13 state undergraduate enrollment. That's another, I'm looking at undergraduate enrollment, not the total, okay? There were 75,572 students. Of those 75,000, 9,194 were African Americans, which represented 12% of these 13 state and regional universities, okay? In Table 4, data indicate that 13 state and regional universities with an overall student enrollment of 75,702 students and a total of 9,194 African American male students, or 12%. The sum total of African Americans in both college and prison was that of 21,000, okay, 419, or 43% were enrolled in college and 57% were incarcerated, when you're only comparing these 13 with those that are incarcerated, okay? So here we got, here again, it was 9 to 10 ratio. That is, for every 10 African American males enrolled in state and regional universities, 9 African American is incarcerated in the state penitentiary here in Georgia, okay? Okay, and this is just showing the number and percent of African, it's not showing the percentage, I got the percentage down here in the bottom, but in regards to African Americans, in regards to that of other types of supervision. And that is, so I'm looking at state supervision being prison, parole, and probation. because in each one you use your right to vote. Okay? Okay? And so, but if you look at each one separately, there are more African Americans in all of these schools, okay, than they are separately being supervised. You got me? You don't. Okay. Okay. We got, if you just look at the total, okay, 27,000 total from the 6 regional universities and the 13 six research universities and the 13 state and regional universities. There were a total of 27,000 African American males incarcerated. And if you look at those that are not incarcerated, but in college, but if you look at those that are in prison, there was 12,225. And those that are on probation, there were 21,361. So if you look at them separately, there are more African Americans in college than up under state supervision. But once you combine those two, okay, then there's 51,261 African Americans that's under state supervision. Or, as I have down here, it says the data indicate that 24% of African American males were incarcerated, 42% were on probation, 34% were on parole. Overall, however, 48% of African Americans were in college, and 53%, that's in terms of the ratio, and 53% were under state supervision. Under state supervision. And we're talking about in proportion to their percentage in the population. Okay? Next one. So overall, for every 4 African Americans incarcerated, 10 are in college. Look, for every 7 African American males on probation, 10 are in college. For every African American male on parole, 10 are in college. Every 6. For every 5 African American males in college, 10 are under state supervision in the state of Georgia. 10 are under state supervision in the state of Georgia. Okay? And so these are some possible solutions. And some of the possible solutions: eliminate that racial bias in the criminal justice system. For nonviolent offenders, immediately restore all constitutional rights once the sentence is completed. Eliminate notification of conviction on job application for nonviolent offenders. Treatment, instead of charging addicts for possession for possible resale, put them in treatment similar to that of those who are taking opiates. Okay? Reduce sentences for nonviolent offenders, including marijuana. And sentences, if possible, should include completion of a GED or a high school diploma that would assist them in terms of employment. Questions now? Yeah?
I noticed you don't have private prisons down there. Is that?
Yes, that's not included either. I just wanted to show. If you look and see, whether it's 40% or 50%, there's a large proportion of African American males throughout Georgia that's under state supervision or in institutions. And a lot of them are in for that of drug offenses. In fact, I remember, I guess it was about, and I oftentimes bring this up, but I was teaching in Tennessee at the time. And I read in, somebody may recall this, but I read in the paper, 18 and others were up on, there were 16 and 15. And the guy who was 18, he was never been in trouble, and he was an honor student. They broke into the cafeteria to eat ice cream. Gave him 2 years in the state penitentiary. First offense ever. First offense ever. They had it here, yes.
Can you speak to the bias in the laws that, if I'm understanding it correctly, that in that African American community, that there might have been a preference for crack cocaine, and that laws were stiffer against those who use crack cocaine versus those who use heroin? Is that true?
Based on my studies and my understanding, they had the same effect. One just was used primarily by whites and middle upper class, and cocaine cost more. In fact, that was the only difference. But they were being sentenced for even like 1 or 2 rocks on them. They were given stiff sentences. I think it was 5 grams of crack was equal to, what was it, not equal to, but in terms of, you could have 10 grams of cocaine, 10 grams of cocaine, and those that were with cocaine got lighter sentences than those who had 5 grams of crack cocaine. It didn't make anybody any violent. I oftentimes tell my students, just because you're under the influence of drugs doesn't mean the drugs caused you to do it. You could have taken the drug 2 weeks ago, but it's still in your system. And they're alluding that the drug caused them to commit the crime in which they committed.
You're talking about
Marijuana or even cocaine or crack. It can still be, if you test it for it, it still may be in your system. But the drug not necessarily caused them to commit the crime.
So we know that that's kind of changing now that the Midwest has all these addictions. Now that the rooster has come home to roost in the households of the judges and the police officers and the politicians. We know that that's changing. However, the problem for me is still this school to prison pipeline and how schools are so anxious to criminalize things that students do, and how African American children are perceived as less than innocent from the time that they're almost in kindergarten to over. There's this presumption that they're not as much children as others, that they're more streetwise, that they're just, that they're promiscuous, that there are all these things that are just projected onto them because they're children of color. So, that being said, what do we start to do to dismantle this so that our children have a fighting chance? Because now you're telling us that 1/3 of all the black children born today might end up in prison. We know this. We know this is our reality. And we know that this disenfranchisement doesn't stop as soon as they get out. Even kids who are supposed to have sentences of 10 or 15 years, it's really a life sentence if you have a felony on your record. It's a life sentence. So they need to stop pretending that it's not.
Right.
When all the doors are shut. The bars are invisible, but they're still there.
Yeah.
So what do we start doing as a community? I know that like in Atlanta now, marijuana is no longer a felony, they've made it a misdemeanor. But I'm just talking about in terms of all crimes. What do we start to do to prevent these kids from getting on that track? But then also when they get out, to give them a fighting second chance, a real second chance, not just one that's a lip service.
Okay, well let me just say this.
So can you tell them a mom's kid?
Let me say this. The Attorney General and up under the current administration, they've gone back to the old ways of doing things. They've asked, in fact, the Attorney General has asked that they repeal the light sentences that Obama had promulgated, and going back to harsher sentences for persons convicted of drugs. I always like to say, if you catch an addict with drugs, why charge him or her for resale? Then nobody in their right mind going to give a crack addict or a drug addict a whole lot of drugs to sell, because they won't see them anymore. Okay, they're gone. Yes, sir.
Larry, first of all, I want to commend you for having documented a very important issue for all black people. You've gone beyond the rhetoric, and what you've done is you've documented facts that all of us need to be aware of. So first of all, I want to commend you on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
The other point that I asked you to indulge me on is here I'm speaking as a former prosecutor, career prosecutor. One of the little known secrets to the general public is what happens to an individual when they're arrested. They're arrested and bond is set. And while the Constitution provides
Right.
Other than, in addition to that, there are many individuals who are held over the Chatham County Jail, which is the biggest one in San Francisco, by the way, who are there because they simply can't make bonds.
Right.
$200 may not be a large amount of money for some of us, but it's a humongous amount for some of them.
Yeah.
As a result of which, they can't make bond, they sit in jail awaiting trial. The prosecutor comes along, offers them a plea to time that they've already served. They'll grab that plea
They'll grab
so they
it,
can
yeah.
get out of jail tomorrow. Meanwhile, they've got a criminal record.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're stamped A with a criminal record. B, next time up, when the prosecutor is looking at their record, they say, oh, you've already got a prior conviction. So they get slammed
Yeah.
the second time. And one of the issues that really needs to be addressed is the whole issue of bail reform. I think that they have that.
Okay. Let me also say this in terms of even when people just get probation, they plead to a probation. That's a conviction. A lot of people don't understand when you plead to probation, that's a conviction. Or you plead to that of first offender, it's a conviction. And although they're walking around, but they still don't have rights to vote, and they don't have, and if people see that, they're going to deny them jobs. Yes.
It's sort of following this. If racism and discrimination is the primary driver for incarceration, then I'm sort of puzzled that our conversation seems to be about crime reduction. If racism and discrimination is the prime driver, then what's puzzling to me is that our conversation is around crime reduction.
No,
For instance, in Venezuela, I think the European Parliament gave the opposition in Venezuela the soldier needs an award.
Yeah.
They did not point out that a lot of opposition leaders are arrested, and whatever the crimes were that they were arrested for should be addressed. They simply said that their imprisonment was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It violated their rights as citizens of Venezuela. So again, I'm sort of puzzled when our conversation seems to revolve around what do we need to do, and even the conversation about crime reduction seems to ignore things like the need for to deal with the plea bargain trap or bail.
Yeah. I hear you. What I think I alluded to it in my paper, but I just didn't come out and say racism. And in terms of that, in terms of every time you talk about crime, crime is a code word for what? Black folks, okay, and black crime. Whether we're talking about war on drugs, get tough on crime, those are code words that we need to get people up under control. And I do know that racism is institutionalized in just about every institution here in America. And in fact, even the culture wars that are going on presently, okay, that's what it's all about. In terms of some people still believe that, that some people are still superior than others. That's what it's about. This is about in terms of limiting immigration to make the population again majority white. Okay, all of that is plays into that of institutional racism. Yes.
It's my belief that one of the possible solutions would be that we start a grassroots movement to remove the idea of the war on drugs, because we know that if you're having a war on drugs that's in our community,
that's
that
right.
It's not in the community where a chief or a sheriff will be getting votes from an empowered group of people, yet the drugs are there.
Yeah.
Drugs are there because they are in a rural community and it's sold to rural.
Yeah.
Whites sell whites, blacks sell to blacks. But yet the war on drugs is aimed at our communities until it is a grassroots movement. Do not count on the stroke of a president's pen, or executive order, or Congress. It must start from the grassroots, as it did with the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. When that guy barreled up the road and killed 27 people in a bus, the children, then it became a mission to let's stop drunk driving. So until we, the community, decide that enough is enough, then we can move forward.
Okay.
I want to say some things from Rapid. We have a problem, and there's a direct correlation. If you ask a kid when they graduated high school, was 2/5 of 100, and they can't answer, they're more likely to go to jail. We graduate folks from the Chatham County system, and I mean, when I say Chatham County, I'm not just talking about public schools. I have clients from Benedictine, St. Andrews, Calvary. You say something to them, it's deers in the headlight. We have a problem because the kids are addicted to electronic crack. They can't concentrate in more than 15 minutes. And if you swing back here, it's a lot of young people on their phone. They couldn't even listen. And this is going to impact their employment because if the kid that looks like you is in trouble when you go to get that job, they pay you. We just took 30 guys through a series where we drug tested them. We took them for a test. We taught them fractions. We taught them how to read a ruler. They all passed. The next day we go out, the guy says, good news in this warehouse. We're going to pay you an additional $3 an hour. That's $20 an hour. The first thing you do, the only thing you have to do is step in this room and give us a sample. 13 of them flunked because they went out and celebrated the night before because they heard on the news that the alderman decriminalized marijuana. This is the stupidity that we have here in Savannah. If you want to do something, grab a kid, get them off his phone, cut off 93 and 94, zero it out, it's noise. If you really want to make a difference, grab 2 or 3 kids and tutor them through high school and get them to college. And if you can score a half-decent SAT or ACT, if you put your head up this much more as an African-American male, you go to school free. I got them at Smith, Howard, Morehouse, Texas Southern, they're begging for them. So it's not that it can't be done, we just ain't doing it. That's it.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Dr. Stokes. Thank you for having the lecture. I have a question. I want to kind of address a few people's remarks.
Go ahead.
But I noticed that we're leaning toward racism, and which is very evident and that's a non-brainer. But we also need to look at the fact that the system of incarceration comes off the back of the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction, which also means it was a form of labor for the economy, and that was a backlash. And what we're experiencing now is the prison system being ingrained in our economic system. And when I say ingrained, I'm talking about traded stock. And stocks went up after the 2016 election. So, and the part that's a bit confusing is you'll see that these rural towns are embracing these prison systems, like CCA, and they're hiring minorities to give them jobs, which is considered a good job for minorities with just a basic high school diploma. So now it's intertwined with the black community who needs a job, who are working for the prison, who are proud to work as a correctional officer. So here we got now, your job depends on somebody else's incarceration. So it's deeper ingrained into our culture and our fabric, our economic fabric now. So we can clean up on this level, but what do we do about these jobs and redirecting where this money is going to come from?
Well, let me just say this from my research, and I had quoted Samuel Yett earlier, and Samuel Yett noted that we, as black people, and especially those that are uneducated, he was saying that we are obsolete because we, in terms of technology, so what the strategy has become, and that is we become more valuable standing on the street corner without jobs and getting into trouble and going to prison than we were when our ancestors were slaves. That's his point. That's his point.
I'm glad the young man back here brought up the point about education because we know that's a great equalizer. But we do a great disservice to kids by assuming that all kids want to go to college.
Yeah.
So what we need to make sure that they start doing is putting vocational programs, coding programs, all kind of IT programs back in the school that don't even require you to have a college degree. You can walk out of high school and make 5 and 6 figures right off the bat. But we don't do that. And then we want to stigmatize the GED. They ought to pass some kind of law in this state that before they're allowed to kick a kid out of the street and say, "But you're not helping out this boy, you don't make us look good, so you go home." That they'll at least empower them with the GED and have a GED class in the school so that when they kick me out, at least I got that. Because guess what? A few years ago, they made the GED harder. And so the inmates that are already in prison, they can't even pass the test. Yeah. And that's one of the stipulations for them getting out.
Okay.
Do you believe that implementing programs in other schools, like in areas where there are high crime areas? Because from what I see from Generation Y, they're very materialistic. If you would just simply help them realize that them getting into trouble is going to disenfranchise you from these opportunities of having a nice car, different things like that, and be able to afford what you want. Don't you think that in their formative years that would help?
Sure. Yeah, you got to start. The research has shown you got to start young. You got to start young, and if you invest in kids at young, then that will probably deter them from life of crime. You got to start young. In fact, some of the data they looked at that I examined said in elementary, you got to start with them. Yes.
Whitney Magawa, that won the Nobel Peace Prize in Kenya, I think she once said that the basis of all conflict is allocation of resources.
Yeah.
And the latest statistics economically say that for every the average household for white income is $171,000 per year. The average household income for blacks is $17,100 per year. So we have a broader allocation, a disproportionate allocation of resources. I think that affects a lot of that's income-based also within the statistics that you're provided us today.
Yeah.
And of course, this is started, as you said, pre-emancipation.
Right.
The income disparity, and on the other end of the income disparity is you have privilege, unearned privilege.
Yeah.
And people making sure that they maintain their resource base based on unearned privilege of skin color.
Yeah.
And so when you have that as a basis for all of this, for the research that's demonstrated, I'm trying to figure out, except for intervention policies, how do you get that as long as you have such a vast, uneven allocation of resources?
Go ahead. I can't answer that one. You can't.
Per household.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the 17 I think is more like 36,000, and compared to that of, let's say, 52,000. Generally, it's about $12,000 more that whites earn on the average than that of blacks. And even when you control for that of education, it's still about the same. Yes, ma'am.
I knew that you said you were focusing on the state prison system, but did you examine any of the private?
No, I didn't examine the private. Those was left out as well. But let me just say this: up under Obama administration, he's signing the legislation getting rid of privatizations of prison, but the current administration just reversed it. And so because it's big business. And in fact, there was a case that happened in Philadelphia, and somehow the juvenile judge was involved. In fact, the juvenile judge, they sent this young African-American male because the judge was getting kickbacks. They were getting kickback for sending them to these private prisons. And I'm telling you, he was getting something like $50,000 to $60,000 a year extra by sending them to prison, even for minor offenses. Yeah. And so if there's one, there are probably others doing the same thing.
And then just on the flip side of it, we were also mentioning that private universities aren't particularly predatory towards minority communities. Is that correct? Is that something that you're seeing as well? Is that, I mean, I know that that even though you didn't look at private universities or the for-profit universities,
Okay.
is that something that you also might have seen as you were doing?
No, I didn't look at it at all. I'm sorry. At some point, I got to cut it off. There's just too many variables. Yeah, but the basis of this is saying, just as there's equally amount of African Americans in prison than there are in college. That's what the data is showing. Yes.
Is there an interest on the part of our local officials to hear your statistics and this horrendous waste of potential and resource?
I have no idea. I just do the research. Pardon me?
How do you bring this forward so that the people who can make a difference with laws?
This is primarily state level, I think, and DA's office. Because those are the ones who are prosecuting people, and police as well, because they're the ones who are arresting people for infraction. So I have no idea.
I think the governor, I thought I heard on the news that the governor made an announcement that they were decriminalizing some of the people in jail. I think I heard it today. And I haven't got the follow-up, but they are doing something that impacts.
Yeah, but it's still a federal offense, though. Marijuana is still a federal offense, and even although they have it in Oregon, Washington, California, Colorado, and even in the District of Columbia, it's still a federal offense. So it depends on who they want to arrest at the time. Say it again?
It's still a state offense.
Yeah, and it's still a state offense too, yeah.
How do you feel about the structuring of K-12 schools? Because as a public school employee, one of the things I know for sure, coming from another state, is that data, whether it's the suspension rates, it is used in the court of law anytime a student gets into any trouble, and that becomes part of their public record.
Yes.
So how do we redirect and curve and work within the K-12 system to begin to modify what data is fed up? Because that's how prisons are being built too, with K-12 data. Whether it's test scores, suspension rates. I know suspension rates is part of it. And if a child gets in trouble outside of the school, they request that information from principals. Was he here?
Yeah.
Were they in the school?
Yeah.
So how do we build something inside the schools to begin to, because if we can't rehabilitate it in the schools, how are we going to rehabilitate them once they're adults?
Yeah, I'm talking about, it's hard. It's going back to, if it is racism, we could do everything on the front end. Guess who's still going to get arrested? Okay, I'm just saying.
What if it's 90-some% black school, and you still got that data?
I've asked this question: what would happen? Well, first of all, if they didn't fill prison with blacks, the prison system will go bankrupt. Okay? But it's money to be made. We are a commodity, but a commodity in the state penitentiary. And yeah, even when you're on probation, you got to pay fees. Okay? Okay. Yes, sir. Take one more.
We only have time for maybe a couple more questions.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, we're past our allotted time, so we're only going to take 2 more questions.
There is a program that addresses the prison, the school to prison pipeline, and it's a program implemented through the mediation center.
Okay.
And in conjunction with the juvenile court, the board of education, and the police department, and it's called community conferencing. And what that program attempts to do, as cases are referred by the judge, such as Judge Burke, through the juvenile court, and they'll refer those cases to the mediation center for what they call community intervention. And if the person, if the youth in this case, satisfies the agreement, then the court doesn't execute the sentence as stated. So there are some intervention measures that have been taking place.
Go ahead.
Just one more.
Okay.
May I, I'm going to make a suggestion, if that's okay.
Okay.
I agree 100% with your last comment. So I'm wondering if there's anyone else who would like to have a further conversation about this reality. The system works the way it's designed to work.
Yeah.
To have a conversation that talks about fixing a system that's not broken.
Yeah. That's, yeah.
Black males incarcerated, it's not an indication that the system is broken. It's an indication the system is working.
Yeah, it's working.
So I would be interested in a conversation that would address this problem in a way that is not about crime reduction, it's not about blaming the victim, it's not about, even though these are conversations need to be had, I'm interested in more sort of like what brothers suggested, what kind of conversation, what kind of discourse can these concerned citizens develop that addresses perhaps other roots that would lead us to addressing.
I'm interested. Okay. Thank you.